Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela Social Studies. All right, so we covered the Native Americans of North and South America, and we also covered the Meso and South Americans in South America and Africa, like the Olmec, the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec. Today we're going to get into transatlantic travel, people coming to America from Europe. So, who were the first Europeans to come to America, and who came after them? And this is what we're looking for. We're looking for that timeline of events of people who are coming over here. So, the first Europeans to reach North America were the Vikings, Leif Erikson and his boys. Now, Vikings were skilled sailors who hailed from Scandinavia. The Vikings raided many countries throughout Europe, and they developed a large trading network. They arrived in Newfoundland, Canada around the year 1000 AD, and there's not much evidence that they ever reached the United States here. They created a settlement there, but with many attacks coming from Native Americans and the isolation of North America, the Vikings eventually returned to Europe. And around the 1400s, other European nations got into the mix of Atlantic exploration. During the 15th century, food had either been bland, meaning no flavor, or putrid, which means tasted really bad, and Asian countries like China had something that everybody wanted: spices. Spices gave food and drink flavor, and some thought that the spices had healing powers. So when motivators about early European exploration are discussed, there are two glaring responses. The number one motivator was to find a sea route and to develop additional trade with Asia and increase the spice trade. Traveling the Silk Road through Asia was getting deadly or expensive. With so many traders traveling the route, there were people who killed for money and spices, or set up toll booths along the way, costing traders more money to travel the road than they actually made in doing the trading. The second reason for early European exploration was to spread Christianity and convert more people. In the 1400s, the Spanish monarchy, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, were Catholic, and they were trying to spread it around the world. The Spanish Inquisition threatened the people of Spain either to convert to Christianity or suffer the fate of death. And what were some of the results of these explorations? The Portuguese were the first people to gain success in the Atlantic. They would leave Portugal and head south around the African coast, and as these Portuguese sailors explored the west coast of Africa, they negotiated for things like gold and ivory, but lastly and most devastating, slaves. The slave trade had effectively begun with the first Portuguese sailors reaching Africa. Slavery led to increased warfare among African kingdoms, devastated many African communities, and broke up many families. Slaves were sent to Europe and to the islands and in the Atlantic, like Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, where they endured brutal living conditions. There are thoughts that the indigenous people of some of these islands were effectively wiped out by labor and replaced by a slave culture. The new slave trade increased Portuguese wealth and power. Once European countries saw this, they immediately launched their own voyages of exploration. And this is where we bring in Christopher Columbus. We have all heard the rhyme: in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This applies to the man who quote unquote discovered America. The quotations are there because Columbus never really stepped foot in the United States proper. Christopher Columbus was a sailor from Genoa, Italy, who heard great stories about the fabulous wealth in Asia, and in 1492 he went to the Spanish monarch, Ferdinand and Isabella, and requested them to pay for his trip, promising them great wealth. Their majesties agreed and funded Columbus's trip to Asia. He took 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and they set sail westward. Unbeknownst to Columbus and his crew, the Americas, or the New World, were in his way. They landed in the Bahamas, where he named the island San Salvador and called the natives Indians. He was not in the Indies. So what were some of the impacts of Columbus exploration? Well, you have the Columbian Exchange. And when Columbus successfully made the trip back and forth to the Americas, a major trade exchange between the Old World, Europe, and the New World, the Americas, began. Today we call this the Columbian Exchange. While explorers brought things like different plants and animals native to Europe and Africa to the Americas, like cows, bananas, and grapes and horses, they brought back different plants and animals that were native to the Americas, like corn, turkey, and potato. However, the item that made the most impact on the New World was European disease. Europeans brought over diseases like smallpox, measles, and the flu, and it's these diseases that brought an end to many of the Mesoamerican, like the Aztec, Inca, and Mayan societies, and millions of Native Americans. And after Columbus, many European countries wanted to add to their land empires. This led to many conflicts in Europe. The Spanish took all the wealth in the form of gold and silver from the New World and became very powerful. They colonized land in Central and South America and in the Caribbean. They were the first European nation to reap the benefits from the New World. They were also successful in converting many of the natives to Catholicism. And after the Spanish successes, countries like England, France, and the Netherlands focused on the Americas to expand their empires. There were so many wars fought in Europe over expansion of empires, and Spain was focused on land claims that it nearly bankrupted itself in wars with England, hence the end of the major Spanish explorations. With the Spanish reduction in Atlantic exploration to the Americas, the two most influential countries to take the lead were England and France. In the 1500s, the English monarch decided to found a colony in North America. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh received a charter, which is a document giving him permission to start a colony, and Raleigh sponsored an expedition of about 100 settlers who sailed to the Americas. Raleigh's crew, led by Ralph Lane, landed in present-day North Carolina and started the first English settlement named the Roanoke Island Colony. Raleigh's colony was not successful, and in 1586 the colony was evacuated. In 1587, John White sailed to North Carolina and established another colony at Roanoke. Due to the lack of supplies in the new colony, White was forced to return to England and retrieve supplies for survival. When White returned to the colony in 1590, and upon his return, the settlement was fortified, but the colony mysteriously disappeared. The only evidence of the settlers' whereabouts was a cryptic message carved into the settlement wall, which said Croatoan. The fate of the 120 settlers was sealed into that word. To this day, scholars do not know what happened to the original settlers at Roanoke. This is why it's called the Lost Colony. One thing about the European expansion was for sure, though, the settlers that came to America were not really hardworking scientists or farmers or tradesmen. There may have been a few, but none to make the difference. There were settlers, explorers, investors, people with money, people who arguably did not practice a trade back in the Old World. This is arguably one of the most important reasons why Europeans brought slaves to the New World. Upon arrival, it was the Native Americans that helped Europeans survive by showing them how to farm and gather supplies. However, the Europeans tried to force the natives into slave labor. Not wanting to become slaves, natives clashed with the settlers on many occasions. Also, since the Native Americans did not have immunities to Old World diseases like smallpox, European diseases wiped out much of the Native American population, causing colonists to look for a new labor force. This is why they look towards Africa. Europeans have been interacting with Africans for many years, and the African people have been able to grow an immunity or a natural resistance to diseases in common Europe like measles, smallpox, and typhus. This is why southern plantation owners brought about 12 million slaves from West Africa to the Americas, and the slave trade from Africa flourished. Most slaves were brought to South America and the Caribbean islands, with a smaller portion actually brought to North America as a whole. In 1510, the Spanish government legalized the sale of slaves in their colonies, and Europeans enslaved millions of Africans and sent them to work in the colonies. Most slaves came from the interior of Africa. They were kidnapped or forced to the west coast of Africa and sent about ships to the New World. 1 out of every 6 slaves died along the Middle Passage, which is the voyage across the Atlantic to reach the Americas, because of horrible living conditions. They were packed inside small places and stacked on top of each other. This slave trade led to the African diaspora, as enslaved Africans were sent all across the world. With the increased number of slaves, the colonial leaders worked to regulate the slave treatment and behavior, but treatment of enslaved Africans varied from person to person. Slavery was brought to North Carolina by the Lords Proprietors almost immediately after North Carolina became a colony. In 1663, they offered additional land acreage for every slave brought to the colony. There were fewer slaves in North Carolina than in other southern colonies, and only Georgia had less. When the Carolinas split in 1729, North Carolina held about 6,000 enslaved Africans compared to about 30,000 from South Carolina. The slaves brought to the Americas needed to have a strong culture to rely on to be able to deal with the harshness of their new lives. Family was a vital part of slave culture. Family provided a refuge, a place not fully under the slaveholder's control. And these families faced many challenges, like being broken apart during the slave trade. Another part of their culture that was important was religion. African religion was one that Christianity blended with traditional African elements. Religion gave slaves a sense of self-worth and hope. They held spirituals, a form of religious expression that gave them hope. They would use songs and folk tales to tell their stories of hope and sorrow, agony and joy. And lastly, art and dance were very important to the slave culture. This allowed them to show a form of expression. Dances were important social events in slave communities that were heavily influenced by African traditions. So you can see we had a lot of influence from early European countries coming over here to the New World. And when they came over here, they wanted gold, they wanted silver, they wanted to create colonies and expand their empires. But one of the worst things to come out of this, of course, was the transatlantic slave trade. All right, so good luck on your test. Make sure you study. And next, we're actually going to get into the 13 colonies, the start of the British Empire in North America.